February 9th, 1960. Morrison, Colorado. Just after 8 in the morning, a thin crust of snow on the foothills, a bridge over Turkey Creek, the water below still skinned with ice, a green and white International Harvester station wagon idling crosswise, blocking the span, its engine running, its radio playing, a brown felt hat on the floorboards, a pair of men's eyeglasses on the bridge railing, blood on the iron, a spent shell casing. At the base of the foothills, 6 miles east, a brewery the size of a small city. 70 acres of malt house and bottling line, a rail spur, a private compound of whitewashed ranch houses, and a single unbroken bloodline of control running back 87 years to a Prussian stowaway. The owner of the station wagon was the 4th generation of that bloodline, 45 years old, chief executive of the largest single-source brewery on earth, father of 4, a creature of absolute routine, driving the same road he drove every morning, from a whitewashed ranch house his grandfather built after a previous kidnapping scare, toward the brewery his great-grandfather founded in a converted tannery. Still standing, still family-owned. But behind the beautiful facade lies a very different story. This is the dark story of Colorado's most guarded dynasty, the Coors Brewing Company and the 70-acre fortress its heirs built out of the fear of being taken. Fear built the walls. Fear will keep building them. If you enjoy deep investigations into American power, place, and the families who shaped them, please like, subscribe, and tell me in the comments which empire to explore next. Your support makes these detailed stories possible. To understand how a bridge in Morrison became the pivot of a 100-year dynasty, you have to go back to a port in Baltimore and a 14-year-old orphan with no ticket and no English. The man who founded the Coors Brewing Company was not born Adolf Coors. He was born Adolf Hermann Joseph Coors in the city of Barmen in Rhenish Prussia on the 4th of February, 1847. His father was a miller named Joseph Coors. His mother was Helena Heim. Both of them were dead by the time Adolf was 15. He was apprenticed briefly at a brewery in Ruhrort, then moved with his siblings to Dortmund, then apprenticed again at a Dortmund brewery the same year his parents died. The journeyman years took him to Kassel, to Berlin, to Uelzen. By the winter of 1867, he was out of money and out of country. In early 1868, he stowed away on a ship to Baltimore. The ship's manifest did not record him. His own family records never recorded how he paid the crew to keep quiet. An unspoken question began to form in Baltimore and never fully left him. The question was not whether he could survive. He had already survived. The question was whether anyone was watching. He worked odd jobs in Chicago. He Americanized his name to Coors, dropping the umlaut and the letter that would have tied him to a family already buried. By 1869, he was foreman of the Stenger Brewery in Naperville, Illinois, a German-owned lager house that supplied the rail crews moving west across Iowa and Nebraska. 3 years there, learning the American brewing market from the underside. 3 years watching which breweries survived the panic of 1873, and which ones dissolved overnight when a bank called in a note. By the spring of 1872, Coors had moved again, this time west to Denver, chasing the rail money and the Colorado silver boom. The silver strikes above Clear Creek had turned Golden, Black Hawk, and Central City into boom towns. The Colorado Central Railroad was building a narrow gauge line up the canyon. Wages in the camps were among the highest in the country, and the miners were thirsty. Coors briefly purchased a partnership in a Denver bottling company. By year's end, he had bought out the founder, a man named John Staderman. He was 25 years old and now sole owner of a business that had nothing to bottle. In the autumn of 1873, he found what he was going to bottle. He and a Denver confectioner named Jacob Schuler, another German immigrant, older with cash, pooled their savings and bought an abandoned tannery at the base of the Rocky Mountains in the placer mining town of Golden, 7,000 feet of elevation, clear spring water out of Clear Creek, a railroad spur under construction, an empty building that had recently been used to boil cattle hides in lime. They converted the tannery into a brewery and opened it the same year. Behind the beautiful facade of every founding myth lies a very different story. The story Adolf Coors told in later years, the orphan, the stowaway, the self-made Westerner, was true in its facts and incomplete in its architecture. The orphan did not build a brewery. Grief built a brewery. The particular architecture of grief that built it, the belief that walls, wells, and private rail spurs were the only reliable insurance against an uncaring world, would never leave the family that inherited it. By 1880, Coors had bought out Jacob Schuler's share and renamed the business the Adolf Coors Golden Brewery. On the 12th of April, 1879, he had married Louisa Weber, daughter of the superintendent of the Denver and Rio Grande Railroad maintenance shops. She would bear him 6 surviving children, 3 sons, 3 daughters, and 2 more who died in infancy. Louisa buried 2 infants and raised 6. Adolf buried 2 infants and built 1 compound. This is not simply a story about a beer. It is about a dynasty that learned very early how expensive it was to be visible and how cheap it was to build a wall. The trap was already being built around the Coors family. They just did not see it yet. The brewery was not a tour. It was a fortification. To understand the physical shape of Coors's Golden, Colorado holdings, you have to understand that by the 1920s, the company did not simply occupy a corner of the town. It was the town. The original converted tannery on Clear Creek expanded through incremental purchases into a mill complex covering roughly 70 acres at its core, with company-controlled land stretching further. A malt house, a bottling line, a cooperage, a private water right on Clear Creek drawn from snowmelt, a company-owned porcelain works that supplied the brewery's own plumbing after a public dispute with suppliers, a private rail spur into the Colorado and Southern Main Line, and eventually a glass bottle plant, because Coors refused to be dependent on outside glass after a supply scare during the First World War. Inside, the machinery of an industrial-scale brewery. Outside, the bare foothills of the Front Range, a town of 2,500 people at the turn of the century, and a labor force pulled from the silver camps above Clear Creek. Inside, a German-American brewing dynasty. Outside, an Anglo-Irish and Cornish miner population whose wages the brewery helped set and whose habits the brewery helped ruin. Inside, luxury triple, beechwood lagering, spring water, German malt. Outside, a company town that did not know it was a company town. Beyond the mill floor, an older story. The labor that built the Coors empire has left fewer names than it should. When the brewery expanded in the 1880s and 90s, the men loading barrels onto the Colorado Central Spur were paid by the shift and not by the hour, which meant that a long day and a short day earned the same wage. Fire tenders worked 12-hour shifts in the boiler house. Barrel washers worked in water that froze in winter and steamed in summer. The cooperage, the room where oak barrels were hooped and sealed, employed a dozen men who were expected to produce enough barrels per week to keep the kegging line running at capacity, and whose pay was docked for the first bad barrel that split on a rail car. These men are not in the company history. They are in the Jefferson County records only when they were injured or when they died. The 1890 labor dispute at the brewery, in which a handful of workers tried to organize over pay, ended in a company victory and a set of practices: the right to fire for cause without documentation, the refusal to recognize any union representation, and the extension of that refusal to every supplier the brewery dealt with. That would define the Coors posture for the next 100 years. The family's stated position was simple. This was not a workplace that negotiated. The unstated position, the one baked into the architecture, was that the brewery was not a public institution at all. It was a private estate with a commercial frontage. The people who worked inside the gates were guests, and a guest who misbehaved could be asked to leave. Prohibition, which arrived in Colorado in 1916, 4 years before the national amendment passed, almost killed the business. It taught Adolph Coors Sr. the second great lesson of his life, after the one Baltimore had taught him. Governments were as dangerous as landlords, and the only reliable insurance was vertical integration. He responded to prohibition the way a man who has already survived one extinction responds. He did not sell. He diversified into porcelain. The Coors Porcelain Company would eventually supply labware to the Manhattan Project, into malted milk, which he sold by the tank car to the Mars Candy Company for the malted milk filling of the bar that would become the Milky Way. He diversified into cement. He diversified into near beer, a barely legal 3.2% malt beverage the company called Manna, which tasted like nothing and sold poorly. He leased brewery buildings out as storage space. He cut the workforce by roughly 2/3 in the first 3 years of Prohibition and retained only the men he trusted to keep the brewery tanks from rusting. The arithmetic was unforgiving. The brewery was producing 0 barrels of legal beer. The revenue from porcelain and malted milk was enough to keep the doors open. It was not enough to keep the original workforce employed. The men who had washed the barrels, tended the boilers, and driven the beer wagons were let go, one household at a time, across a town where the brewery was the largest employer. By the time the 18th Amendment was repealed in December 1933, the Coors brewing operation had been dormant for 17 years. 17 years in which the vast majority of American breweries had gone bankrupt or been absorbed. Of the more than 1,000 American breweries operating before Prohibition, only a small fraction reopened after repeal. Coors was one of them. The old man built a bunker first and a brewery second. The brewery was the part of the estate he showed visitors. The bunker was the part he did not. He did not live to see the reopening. On the 5th of June, 1929, in a suite on the 6th floor of the Cavalier Hotel in Virginia Beach, Virginia, Adolph Coors Sr. fell, or jumped, from a window. He was 82. His wife, Louisa, the only witness, testified that he had woken early, walked to the window, and, without a word, either fallen or stepped through. The Virginia coroner, R.W. Woodhouse, declined to conduct an autopsy. The local paper called it a suicide. The family never publicly contested the finding and never publicly confirmed it. In his will, Adolph left a single small instruction concerning his final hours. His hotel bill was to be paid in full. No note, no explanation. His body was returned to Colorado and buried in the company town he had built. His sons inherited a brewery that was, at that moment, producing no beer. The line held for the moment. It would not hold for the next generation without a price. From the outside, an immigrant success story ending in tragedy. Behind it, a pattern the next 3 generations of Coors men would repeat in minor, key, and major. Survival by retreat, expansion by wall building, grief converted directly into real estate. Fear built the walls. It would go on building them for another 90 years. The arithmetic was already forming, even if the Coors family could not yet see the full ledger. A dynasty does not inherit a fortune. It inherits a set of habits about what the fortune is for. For the Coors family, after 1929, the fortune was for one thing above all else. It was for not being taken. Then came 1933. The second Adolf Coors Jr., known inside the family as Ad Jr., had assumed working control of the brewery shortly before his father's death. He was a calmer man than his father, less Prussian, more Rocky Mountain. He ran the company the way his father had run it, which was by not running it publicly at all. He took no interviews. He joined no civic boards. He let his brothers Grover and Herman handle the public-facing side. He himself preferred to be at home, or at the brewery, or on horseback on the family's Morrison ranch, which sat about 12 miles south of Golden at the edge of the foothills, at the bottom of a road that ran past a bridge over Turkey Creek. In 1933, the year of repeal, Adolf Jr. nearly disappeared. He was not the biggest fish in Denver that year. His best friend was. On the 12th of February, 1933, two men with guns, a South Dakota chicken and turkey rancher named Vern Sankey and his accomplice Gordon Alcorn, ambushed 31-year-old Charles Boettcher II and his wife Anna Lou in the driveway of their Denver home. They forced Boettcher into a car, drove him 900 miles north to Sankey's turkey ranch outside Gan Valley, South Dakota, and held him for 17 days in a pit dug beneath the ranch floor. The ransom was $60,000. The Boettcher family paid. On the 1st of March, Boettcher was released, blindfolded, at the Denver stockyards. The case was the first kidnapping actively investigated by the FBI under the new Lindbergh law, which empowered federal agents to pursue kidnappers across state lines. Vern Sankey became J. Edgar Hoover's first official public enemy #1. He was captured in a Chicago barbershop on the 31st of January, 1934, and hanged himself in his South Dakota cell on the first night of his imprisonment. Adolf Coors Jr. had been on the same list as Boettcher. The plot against him was intercepted by private investigators hired by the family within weeks of the Boettcher abduction. He did not spend a single hour in captivity. He did not lose a single dollar in ransom. And yet, from that year forward, a new rule was introduced inside the Coors family. Coors men were required to spend much of their after-hours time on the company compound, in a cluster of whitewashed ranch houses on the brewery's own land, behind the brewery's own fences, under the brewery's own security. This rule was not written down. No one told a journalist. No one told a labor negotiator. It was the quiet domestic architecture of a family that had learned, in the same year it regained the right to make beer, that it could also be taken at any moment. The same ranch house, different fears. That was the pattern. The walls did not come down when the ransom never arrived. The walls went up. Beautiful, yes. The family portrait at Christmas 1933. The three Coors sons in dark suits on the porch of the family ranch. The brewery rail spur visible behind them, the lights of Golden down the slope. But inside the perimeter, a rule that the sons and their sons and their sons would obey for the next quarter century. Do not sleep outside the fence. Do not drive alone if you can help it. Do not develop a routine an outsider can chart. Do not take the same road at the same hour. The rule lasted from 1933 until February 9th, 1960, and on February 9th, 1960, the fourth generation of the Coors family broke the rule for the last time. He drove alone, on the same road, at the same hour, to the same building. For 27 years, no one had tried. Someone, by then, had been watching for a very long time. By the winter of 1959, the Coors Brewing Company was among the largest single-source breweries in the United States. A single plant in Golden, Colorado, shipping only in refrigerated rail cars because Coors refused to pasteurize its product, selling only in a handful of western states because the logistics of cold chain would not yet stretch further. The man running it was the third generation. Adolf Coors III, known inside the family as Ad III, or simply Ad, was the eldest son of Adolf Jr. He was born in 1915, graduated from Cornell University with a degree in industrial engineering, served in the Army during the Second World War, and returned home to a chair that had been kept warm for him since childhood. He was chairman of the board. His younger brothers, Bill and Joe, ran the day-to-day. Ad handled the larger strategic picture, the cold chain, the distribution network, the long decisions about expansion. He was quiet where his grandfather had been stern and his father withdrawn. He was a trained engineer married to a woman from Virginia horse country, Mary Urquhart Grant, whom he had married in November of 1940, and with whom he was raising 4 children on a ranch outside Morrison, 12 miles south of the brewery. The ranch was the family's compromise with the 1933 rule. Not the whitewashed compound on company land, but close enough. A sprawling foothills property with stables, a barn, a main house that looked like an English country manor translated into Colorado sandstone. The driveway came out onto a 2-lane county road. The road ran north past a bridge over Turkey Creek, then climbed a low rise, then descended into the long valley that led to Golden and the brewery. Ad Coors drove that road every morning, at the same time, in the same car, for years. From the outside, the picture of a fourth-generation American industrialist. Behind it, a man whose father had been the target of a kidnapping plot 27 years earlier, whose grandfather had fallen or jumped from a hotel window in Virginia Beach, whose entire family fortune had been built around the assumption that visibility was a liability. Ad III knew this. He had grown up inside the rule. He had chosen, gradually, to bend it. The trap was already being built in a rented apartment in Denver. Ad just did not see it yet. The man in the apartment was not a professional kidnapper. He was a 31-year-old fugitive named Joseph Corbett, Jr., born in the state of Washington in October of 1928. He was the son of a newspaper editor, a former honor student, a young man with a measured IQ in the superior range, and a psychological profile in a much darker one. In 1951, at the age of 22, he had shot and killed a hitchhiker on a highway south of Seattle. He had been convicted of second-degree murder in California. He had been transferred to the California Institution for Men at Chino in April of 1955. On the 1st of August, 1955, he had crawled out through a window in the shower room of that institution and scaled the fence. He had fled first to Glendale, then to Los Angeles, where he had briefly worked as a clerk under the alias Walter Osborne. By December of 1955, he had arrived in Denver. He had rented an apartment. He had taken a job in a paint factory. He had kept to himself. He did not drink, did not socialize, did not attract attention. For 4 years he lived as Walter Osborne in Denver, a factory worker with no family, no phone, and no neighbors who could place him. In the months before the kidnapping, he did 3 things that would, in retrospect, become the evidence that convicted him. He purchased a handgun through a mail-order firearms dealer. He purchased a pair of leg irons and a pair of handcuffs through a separate mail-order catalog under the Osborne name. And he acquired a yellow Mercury sedan that he had modified to hold a man in the trunk, a trunk he had insulated with a blanket and a length of baling wire. He did not tell anyone what the gun, the handcuffs, and the modified trunk were for. The investigators would later conclude that he had been preparing for the kidnapping for roughly 6 months. He had been following Coors' morning commute, timing the drive across Turkey Creek Bridge, learning that the Coors car stopped on the bridge almost every day because Ad was in the habit of looking down at the creek and checking the ice level. The bridge was single-lane. It was isolated. It had a blind curve on the western approach. It was the one place on the commute where the driver of the Coors car had to slow to a near stop. Corbett's plan, reconstructed later from the physical evidence, was simple. Park his yellow Mercury on the bridge so it appeared broken down. Wait for Ad Coors to arrive, stop behind him, and get out to see what the problem was. Produce the handgun, restrain him with the handcuffs and leg irons, force him into the trunk of the yellow Mercury, drive him north into the foothills, hold him until the ransom was paid. On the morning of February 9th, 1960, the plan collapsed in the first 30 seconds. Beyond the gates of the Morrison ranch, a cold Tuesday. The sun had not yet cleared the ridgeline. Ad Coors' company-owned green and white International Harvester Travelall was warming up in the driveway. He kissed Mary goodbye. He got into the car. He drove north. A short time later, a milkman making his round near the Turkey Creek Bridge sounded his horn several times, trying to get the driver of a station wagon to clear the span. The wagon did not move. When the milkman got out to look, he found it empty. The engine was running. The radio was playing. A brown felt hat was on the floorboards. A pair of eyeglasses was balanced on the bridge railing. Dark stains were visible on the iron railing and on the planks of the bridge. A spent shell casing lay nearby. Ad Coors was gone. The milkman did not touch anything. He drove to the nearest farmhouse with a telephone and called the Jefferson County Sheriff. The sheriff called the brewery. The brewery called Mary. Mary called her father-in-law, Adolph Jr., who was in his house on the whitewashed company compound in Golden. Adolph Jr. did what his father's rule had taught him to do. He did not call the press. He called the FBI. By noon, the Denver field office of the FBI had taken jurisdiction under the Lindbergh Law. By nightfall, more than 50 agents were in Colorado. Roadblocks went up on every east-west highway out of the state. The brewery offered a standing reward of $25,000. The family waited. The next day, Mary Coors received a typewritten letter. It had been mailed in Denver the afternoon of the kidnapping and contained specific instructions. The ransom was $500,000. The breakdown was exact. $200,000 in $10 bills, $300,000 in $20 bills. The currency had to be used. The bills could not be consecutive. The note instructed Mary to place a classified advertisement in the Denver Post, "We are ready, Mr. King," once the money was gathered, and to wait for further instructions. Adolph Jr. called a private banker in Boston. $500,000 in non-consecutive used bills is a surprisingly difficult sum to assemble. The Boston bank flew the cash to Denver overnight. Mary's brother placed the classified ad in the Post. The family waited for the call. The call never came. Days passed. A week. 2 weeks. The classified ad ran every day. The Denver Post covered the story in restrained headlines on the front page. Reporters staked out the ranch and the brewery. Mary received phone calls from people pretending to be kidnappers, from psychics, from people claiming to have seen her husband in a car in Mexico. None of them were real. She did not sleep. She drank more than she should have. She kept the $500,000 in the house, in a locked case, in the closet of the spare bedroom. The bubble held for the moment. It would not hold forever. Days after the kidnapping, the burned-out shell of a yellow Mercury sedan was found in a canyon in the northern Rocky Mountain foothills. The car was too damaged to yield fingerprints, but it was registered in Denver to a man named Walter Osborne. When the FBI traced the registration to the Osborne rental, they found the mail-order invoice for the handgun, a matching invoice for the handcuffs and leg irons, and a typewriter whose typeface matched the ransom note exactly. They also found an insurance policy held by Walter Osborne, which named as its beneficiary one Joseph Corbett, Jr., an escaped murder convict from the California Institution for Men. Walter Osborne had never existed as a legal person. He had been the second skin of Joseph Corbett, Jr. for nearly 5 years. The FBI had a name. They did not have a body. They did not have a living victim. They had, for the moment, only a shape of what had happened. In the FBI's reconstruction, later confirmed by the soil evidence, Corbett had tried to force Coors into the trunk of the Yellow Mercury at gunpoint. A trained infantry officer, and twice the man in a physical sense, had fought him. There had been a struggle on the bridge. Corbett had shot him twice in the back. He had panicked. Instead of loading the body into the trunk as planned, he had dumped it in the Colorado foothills south of Morrison and driven the Yellow Mercury north to burn it. The ransom note, already in the mail, had been sent by a man who no longer had anyone to ransom. The soil itself would prove the root. When FBI forensic technicians examined the undercarriage of the burned Mercury, they found traces of a distinctive pink granite and feldspar mineral blend, a mineral signature native to a narrow band of Colorado foothills south of the Morrison Ranch, in the forests above Sedalia and Jackson Creek. The analysis would not recover the body. That would take chance and time. But it pinned the getaway car's route, and it quietly ruled out the alternative theories that had consumed the family in the first weeks, that Coors had been taken into Mexico, that he was alive in a hospital somewhere, that the ransom might still be paid. The math was simple and brutal. There had never been a living hostage after 7:55 that morning. The $500,000 in the closet was going to stay in the closet. The FBI did not tell the family. The agents in charge of the case made a decision. They would let the family hold on to hope a little longer. They would not confirm the math until they had a body to confirm it with. They continued the search. Dogs, helicopters, grid teams. The entire southern foothills of the Front Range combed, ravine by ravine. They needed the body. 7 months passed. The case became the first major national kidnapping story of the television era, running on the evening news for most of 1960. The Reader's Digest ran a profile of Corbett. The FBI distributed his photograph to every post office in North America and placed him on the 10 most wanted fugitives list. Mary Coors did not attend the social events she used to attend. She did not leave the ranch. She drank. Her 4 children were placed under armed guard at school. Reporters were kept off the property by hired security. The brewery installed new gates. Then came September 11, 1960. Hikers in a remote dump area about 12 miles southwest of the town of Sedalia, in Douglas County, Colorado, a backwoods site near a small track off Jackson Creek Road, came across a pair of trousers in the woods. 3 days later, on September 14th, the rest of the remains had been recovered from the dump. A skull, a knife, a wristwatch, a set of car keys, a belt buckle stamped with Adolf Coors III's initials. The skeleton was picked over by coyotes and weather. 2 bullet wounds were clearly documented in the shoulder and back. Both were entry wounds. Both had been fired from behind. On September 12, 1960, the FBI told Mary Coors that her husband was dead. She had known for 7 months. She said nothing for a very long time, and then she nodded. Corbett was still missing. He had run. In the weeks after the kidnapping, he had moved under a sequence of false names through Las Vegas and Los Angeles, flown to Toronto, and finally settled in Vancouver, British Columbia, where he had rented a basement room and lived off the last of his savings from the paint factory. A Reader's Digest subscriber in Vancouver recognized his photograph in the magazine and called the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. On the 29th of October 1960, officers walked into the basement room and took him without incident. He did not resist. He was extradited to Colorado. He stood trial in Golden in March of 1961. The jury took less than 4 hours to convict. The sentence was life in prison. He served 19 years. He was paroled in 1980, moved back to Denver, lived alone in a single-room apartment, refused every interview, and died by his own hand in 2009 at the age of 80. He never admitted to the killing. But the 7 months ran out in a ravine in Douglas County, and what the family buried in the churchyard at Golden was not a man. It was the last thing the walls had ever been built to keep out. Fear built the walls. From that day forward, they went up for real. From the outside, a funeral. Behind it, a fortress going up by the square foot. In the weeks after Ad Coors III was buried at the Golden Cemetery, his widow, Mary Urquhart Grant Coors, did the first of what would become a long sequence of quiet decisions. She sold the ranch outside Morrison, the home where she had raised 4 children, the home her husband had driven from every morning, the home that sat at the end of the road that crossed the Turkey Creek Bridge. The sale price was reported at roughly $200,000. She sold it within months of her husband's burial. She moved into the family compound at Golden, behind the walls her grandfather-in-law had built for a different reason. She did not describe the sale as a retreat. She did not give interviews. Her drinking, which had started during the 7 months of waiting, became, over the next decade, the structural feature of her days. It was the thing the staff worked around. It was the thing her children learned to read as a weather report. The same ranch house, different fears. The whitewashed compound on Coors' property had been built after 1933 to protect the second generation. By the mid-1960s, it was protecting the third and the fourth. Guardhouses, high fences, new gates, armed men on shift work. A driveway routing that meant no family member ever drove the same sequence of turns 2 days in a row. The lesson the family took from Turkey Creek Bridge was not that Joseph Corbett was a specific and catchable man. The lesson was that the world outside the gates had always been, and would always be, a place where the Coors name drew a certain kind of attention. Walk into Golden today, and you can still feel it. The brewery complex, now Molson Coors, after the 2005 merger, is still on the original Clear Creek site. The perimeter has moved outward, not inward. The guard booths have been rebuilt. The whitewashed ranch houses on the original compound are no longer used as primary residences, but they still stand, still on private property, still off the public map. The fence is not ornamental. Behind the gates, The other half of the family's response to 1960 was not architectural, it was political. The most consequential Coors of the generation that buried Ad III was not his son, it was his younger brother, Joseph Coors. Joe Coors had shared operational control of the brewery with his older brother Bill Coors since the early 1950s. After Ad III's murder, the two brothers ran the company together for the rest of the decade. By the late 1960s, Joe had come to a conclusion that bordered on faith. The United States was losing something essential, and the thing it was losing could be named, identified, and funded back into existence. On the 16th of February, 1973, Joseph Coors put up the seed money for a new conservative policy institute in Washington, D.C. He contributed $250,000 to its first-year budget and committed $300,000 a year thereafter. The institute was called the Heritage Foundation. Its other founders were a young Republican political operative named Paul Weyrich and a think tank veteran named Edwin Fuellner. Heritage had, at its founding, a single Coors check and a small rented office. Within a decade, it was the most influential conservative think tank in the United States. Within 30, its policy briefs would shape the Reagan transition, the Bush tax cuts, and, much later, the document called Project 2025. But Heritage was only one of the vehicles. Joseph Coors also funded the John Birch Society, the National Right to Work Committee, Stop ERA, Campus Crusade for Christ, the Mountain States Legal Foundation, led by the future Reagan Interior Secretary James Watt, and the campaigns of senators, including Strom Thurmond. He bankrolled Television News Incorporated, an in-house conservative news service intended to feed local stations a rival to the Associated Press and United Press International. On the 8th of August, 1974, Richard Nixon's last day as president and one of the final acts of his administration, Nixon nominated Joseph Coors to the board of the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. Gerald Ford renewed the nomination after Nixon resigned. In 1975, the Senate Commerce Committee rejected the nomination by a vote of 11-6. The senator leading the opposition, John Pastore of Rhode Island, told Coors during the confirmation hearings that no nomination the subcommittee had ever reviewed had bothered him more than his. The specific sticking points: Coors' refusal to divest from Television News Incorporated and his stated admiration for the political program of the John Birch Society. This is not simply a story about a beer. It is about a family whose grief at an open bridge in 1960 became, inside a single generation, a national political project whose fear of disorder could be financed against any target the family chose. But the bills did not care about narratives. The other half of the ledger came due at the same time. Beyond the gates of the Golden Compound, a very different story was assembling among the people who worked inside them. By the mid-1970s, the Coors Brewery had become what its critics called the most invasive workplace in American brewing. Job applicants were required to submit to a polygraph test. The questions they were asked, according to documented complaints, included whether they had ever been a member of a labor union, whether they had ever been arrested, whether they had ever used illegal drugs, what their political views were, and, in a practice the family has never fully denied, whether they were homosexual. The brewery maintained what it publicly described as 21 grounds for dismissal. The polygraph was the entrance, and the 21 grounds were the back door. On the 5th of April, 1977, roughly 1,500 members of Brewery Workers Local 366 walked off the job at the Golden Plant. The strike was not, at its core, about wages. It was about the polygraph, about the dismissal rules, and about the company's refusal to negotiate on either. The president of Local 366 was a man named David Sickler, an 11-year Coors employee, a tank washer and bottler who had risen through the local, a Coloradan who had started his working life inside the Golden plant and now found himself across a picket line from the family he had once worked for. Sickler did something that no previous Coors opponent had tried. He studied the history of every successful American consumer boycott, the United Farm Workers lettuce and grape boycotts, the Montgomery bus boycott, the anti-apartheid campaigns already building on college campuses, and built a new one out of their pattern. He sent striker envoys west, east, and south. He made the case in Los Angeles union halls. He made it in Mexican-American community centers in East L.A., where Chicano activists had long memories of the polygraph questions Coors applicants had reported. He made it in the Castro district of San Francisco. The gay political organizer Harvey Milk, who had been asking Castro bars to boycott Coors since 1974, 3 years before the strike, had by 1977 become the natural partner for the Teamsters campaign against the brewery. When a Teamsters organizer asked Milk for help extending the boycott into the gay bars, Milk agreed on a single condition: that the union hire more gay drivers. The deal held. Before his assassination in November of 1978, Milk had turned a can of Coors on a Castro counter into a political signal readable from the door. Sickler made the case in the lobbies of the AFL-CIO, in Denver union halls, and across city councils that began refusing to allow Coors at municipal events. The case was simple. Coors was a company whose hiring machine had been used on the record to screen out every kind of worker these groups represented. A boycott of Coors beer was not a labor action. It was a civil rights action with a brand name attached. The ledger was pitiless. The strike lasted 20 months. The company replaced the strikers with strikebreakers. In December of 1978, after the National Labor Relations Board supervised a decertification vote, the workers inside the Golden plant voted 993 to 408 to remove Local 366 as their bargaining agent. 44 years of union representation at Coors ended on a single afternoon. Sickler had lost the strike. He had not lost the boycott. For the next 9 years, from 1978 until the formal settlement in 1987, Sickler took the Coors boycott from city to city. He was a named micro-character in a fight whose other side was a dynasty. He walked into union halls in Los Angeles, into gay bars in the Castro, into Chicano community centers in East L.A., into the headquarters of the AFL-CIO. The boycott covered most of the company's sales territory. In California, Coors' single largest market, the company's share collapsed from more than 40% in the early 1970s to as low as 17% by the early 1980s. But the Bills did not care about the boycott. Because while Sickler was losing the strike and winning the boycott, the Coors family was writing checks in Washington that would pay them back many times over. The Heritage Foundation produced a document in January of 1981 called Mandate for Leadership, a 2-volume policy brief handed to the incoming Reagan administration as its transition playbook. Among its recommendations, weaken the National Labor Relations Board, slow the enforcement of existing labor law, roll back federal oversight of private sector hiring practices, defund the regulatory capacity that had made decertification votes possible, and consumer boycotts effective. The Reagan administration adopted a substantial portion of Mandate's recommendations over the course of its first term, including the appointment of James Watt, funded by Joseph Coors, through the Mountain States Legal Foundation as Secretary of the Interior. The same dynasty that had lost a family member to a handgun on a bridge in 1960 had, within 20 years, lost the Union on its factory floor and bought, through the Heritage Foundation and its allied vehicles, the political architecture that would make the loss permanent. From the outside, the arithmetic of American capitalism. Behind it, a grief converted directly into policy. The walls the family had built around its grandchildren were the small version. The walls it built around its workforce, and then around the federal labor apparatus itself, were the large version. Every dynasty has its kidnappers. Every fortune has its fence. Mary Urquhart Grant Coors did not live to see the boycott lifted. The trauma she had absorbed at Turkey Creek Bridge did not release her. Her eldest daughter, Mary Brooke Coors, died of cancer in 1968 at the age of 26, 8 years after her father was taken, and 2 years before her mother would stop being able to read a room. Mary herself died in 1975. She was 60 years old. She was at a friend's home in Aspen. She fell. The cause of death was ruled accidental. 2 generations of Coors women lost in a 15-year arc that began on a morning drive in February of 1960. What remains are questions. Was it the kidnapping that radicalized the Coors family into a national political project, or had the project been there all along, seeded in 1868 in the mind of an orphan stowaway who had learned at 15 that the world took things it was not entitled to? Was the Heritage Foundation a memorial to Adolf III, or to his grandfather, or to a Prussian cemetery neither of them had ever seen? Would the walls around the Golden Compound, the polygraph in the hiring room, the checks to James Watt and to the John Birch Society, to Paul Weyrich and to Edwin Fuellner, have been written if the station wagon had made it across the bridge on the morning of February 9th, 1960? Almost certainly, yes. The rule had been written in 1933. The kidnapping only raised the price. Who paid for the fence? The workers paid, 993 to 408 in a single vote. The children paid, the 4 who grew up with armed guards at their school gates, the daughter who did not reach 30, the widow who did not reach Medicare age. The unions paid. 44 years of representation ended on the floor where the first barrels had been filled in 1873. The country paid, through a policy apparatus whose architecture can still be read in the labor statutes of the 1980s. The dynasty paid, too, in its own way, in the internal silence, in the sons who never gave interviews, in the compound that is still walled today. Fear built the walls. Fear built them in 1868, when a 15-year-old orphan Americanized his name to hide from a family that was already dead. Fear built them in 1933, after a chicken rancher in South Dakota forced a Denver millionaire into a pit under a turkey barn. Fear built them in 1960, on a bridge where a fugitive with a mail-order pistol tried to trade a life for $500,000 and walked away with nothing. Fear built them in 1973, in an office in Washington where a brewery check funded the think tank that would remake a federal government. Every wall tells you what the builder was afraid of. Every fence tells you what the builder thought was waiting on the other side. Tell me in the comments, which empire should we explore next? The DuPont powder mills on the Brandywine, whose owners held more munitions contracts than any company in American history. The Hearst media empire stretching from San Simeon to Manhattan, whose founder commanded 28 newspapers and could break a politician with a single editorial. The Yellowstone Club hidden in the Montana Rockies, whose private ski mountain admits only billionaires through its locked gates. Or something unexpected, a forgotten company town whose scandal never made the national papers. I'll see you in the next investigation.